Now we are going to third one. What is that? Montreal Amendment. Okay. So remember this amendments. Amendments are very, very important in your examination. Okay. So now you see here, Montreal Amendment. So this is the ninth meeting, right? Ninth meeting. So in this amendment, it was included, what is the phase out schedule for hydrochlorofluorocarbons, right? So it was introduced for developing countries. So as well as the deadline for the phase out of methyl bromide. What is that? Methyl bromide was moved. Right? So moved to forced in developed and developing countries in 2005, right? 2005 and 2015 respectively, right? 2005 and 2015. So this is the Montreal. So in the year of 1997. And now next meeting. So this is the 11th meeting. Montreal is 9th meeting and this is the Beijing Amendment. So in the year of 1999. Okay. 1999. So in this meeting or in this amendment included tighten controls. Tighter controls on the production and trade of hydrochlorofluorocarbons. So those were introduced. And bromochloromethane. So it was also added to the list of controlled substances with phase out targeted for which year? 2004. Okay, 2004. So in 2015, the Montreal Protocol became the first universally ratified international treaty. So it is signed by all, how many members? All 197 members of the United States in the, so those were signed in this amendment, right? So next one is Kigali Amendment, right? Kigali Amendment. So what is Kigali Amendment? You see here. So in the so this is the 28th meeting. You see here, 28th meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol. Okay, this one. Okay, and negotiators from how many peoples? 197, right? 197 nations have signed. So a historical agreement to amend the Montreal Protocol in Kigali. So Kigali is a capital city of a tiny African country. So that is Rwanda. So on 15th, right? 15th or 10 to 14th October 2016, right? So as per the agreement, so these some countries are the expected to reduce which these countries. What is the countries? How many countries is there? 197, right? So these 197 countries are expected to reduce the manufacture and use of hydrofluorocarbons. What is that? Hydrofluorocarbons. So by roughly how much? 80, right? 80 to 85%. 80 to 85% from their respective baseline till when? 2045. right? 2045. So this phase down is expected to arrest the global average temperature rise up to 0.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 year, 2100, right? So in 2006 in Kigali, the hydrofluorocarbons were added to the Montreal Protocol, and hydrofluorocarbons were also used as replacement, right? Replacement compounds for chlorofluorocarbons, and they do not affect the ozone layer, right? So, but they are strong greenhouse gases, right? So now, in the Kigali Amendment, so those are important points is there. So what are the important points, right? So it is, so the Kigali Agreement, it is a legally binding agreement between the signatory parties with non-compliance measures, signatories parties with non-compliance measures. So it will come into effect from 1st January 2019. It provided it is ratified by at least how many members? 20 members parties by then, right? 20 members. So it has shown a considerable flexibility in approach while setting phase down targets for different economies and accommodating their developmental aspirations and different socio-economic compulsions and also scientific and technological capabilities, right? So now you see here, so it has divided the signatory parties into 3 groups, right? So first one is group 1 and group 2 and group 3. So now in group 1, the first group consists of the rich and developed economics. What are those? Like USA, UK, and UE countries. So who will start the phase down hydrofluorocarbons by 2019 and reduce it to 15% of 2012 levels by 2036, right? So these are the developed countries are developed economies. And second group. So in that second group consists of emerging economies like China, Brazil, and also African uh, countries, some of African countries who will start phase down by 2024 and reduce it to 20% of 2021 levels by 2045. Okay. And another one is last one, group 3. So this third group consists of developing economies, developing economies, and some of the hottest climatic countries like India, Pakistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. So who will start phasing down hydrofluorocarbons by 2028, and it reduced it to 15%, right? 15% of 2024 to 2026 levels till 2407. So these are the 3 signatories parties that is divided in 3 groups, right? So it has also a provision for multilateral fund for developing countries for adaptation and mitigation. So the Technology and Energy Assessment Panel, it's called TEAP. TEAP, the Technology and Energy Assessment Panel. So it will take a periodic review of the alternative technologies and products for their energy efficiency and safety standards, right? So now why is this Kigali agreement significant? Why? Why? Because so it strengthens the Paris Agreement, right? Paris Agreement, which sets an ambitions or targets of restricting the rise in a global temperature below how much? Below 2 degree Celsius. So as compared to pre-industrial level, right? So unlike the Paris Agreement, it gives clear and concrete and mandatory targets with fixed timelines to the signatory parties to achieve their targets, right? So it would prevent the emissions of hydrofluorocarbons that is equivalent to how much? 70 billion tons of carbon dioxide, right? 70 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Okay. So now, Kigali amendment in India. So India played a very flexible and cooperative role in the whole negotiating process, right? So it has agreed on a lenient schedule as it consumes only how much? 3%, right? 3% of hydrofluorocarbons as compared to the other nations like USA 37% and China 25%, right? So it would be tough for Indian to adhere to this agreement along with Paris Pact, especially when it has embarked on a ambitious Make in India, right? Make in India program to increase its industrial production, right? What is the program? Make in India, right? So it should also take into considerations the hot climatic conditions and growing demand for air conditions, refrigerators, and also cars. So with growing middle class incomes while implementing the program, right? So still, it is a responsible nation with a global perspective. The Indian government, it has voluntarily passed the order to stop the which one? Production of hydrofluorocarbon 23, right? 23. So which is a byproduct of commonly used in which one? Refrigerators, right? Refrigerant. So this will reduce the emission by 100 million tons equivalent of carbon dioxide in next 15 years. Okay, next 15 years. So now, what are the implications of Kigali agreement on India? So now, Indian industries using what is that? Fluorocarbons like air conditioning industry, automobiles and refrigeration industry. So have some serious implications, right? On financial and technical fronts. So now you see those are first one is financial implications. So what are the financial implications? So some of the industries have to either invest in R&D, that is to find out the substitutes for hydrofluorocarbons, or they have to buy patented substances and technologies from the other MNCs companies, right? And it's consequently the cost of production, it will increase, which may ultimately shrink the buyer base for their products, right? And second one is technological implications. So the technological implications, some of the developed nations, so those have already started using substitutes of these hydrofluorocarbons in their products, and it has a sound technological knowledge about their use, right? So without technology transfer or research, it would be difficult. So for domestic industries to compete with them in global as well as domestic markets, right? Domestic industries are markets. So now, so the Montreal Protocol has been generally very successful. There is mostly strong compliance with its regulations, right? So, and the major ozone depleting substances have started to decrease in the atmosphere, right? So now you see, um, we are now starting to see the first sign of the ozone layer beginning to heal, right? So this phase down is expected to recover the global average temperature, rise up to how much? I already told about that, 0.5, right? 0.5 degree Celsius between 2050 here, right? 2050 to 2100. Okay? 2100. So you see here some of the pictures here. So you see here from 1980 to 2060, right? So these are the with the Montreal Protocol and without the Montreal Protocol. So you see here. Okay. So right. So this topic is over. Just wait, I will upload another PPT. Okay, right. So now next topic is, so up to here Montreal Protocol is over, right? So you got the amendments and etc. Right? So now what is Kyoto Protocol? So now what is the difference between Montreal Protocol and Kyoto Protocol? So now, so while the Montreal Protocol was established to, what is that? Phase out substances that deplete ozone, right? So now the Kyoto Protocol was set in place to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, right? So with the exception to ozone depleting substances, right? So the Kyoto Protocol is an agreement signed as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? So now you see here, so this is the meeting. So the UNCAD, it means United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So in the year of which year? 1992, a major environment related summit was held, that is called the Rio, right? Rio Earth Summit, Rio Earth Summit. You see here, this is the Rio Day. So Rio Earth Summit. Okay. So this is the landmarks summit in the field of environment, climate change, and biodiversity conservation. Because at the Rio Summit, all the countries, they came together and they worked out several important agreements and conventions, so which were designed to protect our environment. So that is when the in Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was brought out for the first time the world was taking climate change seriously, and global efforts were initiated to tackle the threat posed by climate change and also global warming, along with that the Convention on Biological Diversity was also adapted to conserve and protect our biodiversity. So even the UN Convention to combat desertification was also adapted to tackle the threat of soil degradation and also desertification, right? So this Rio Earth Summit was a landmark event that gave birth to what is that important conventions, international conventions in the field of environment and also biodiversity protection. So one of the most important convention was this one, UNCED. So that was a dedicated platform to fight which one? Climate change, right? Climate change. So every year from this 1992, the Conference of Parties would be held under the UNCED. The countries around the world, all the UN members, they would come together at the Conference of Parties, and they discuss ways and measures to tackle the threat posed by which one? Climate change. So because by now climate science had evolved and scientific evidence had emerged. So that greenhouse gas emissions, which were a result of our industrial agricultural activities, so they were directly responsible for rising temperatures, so that we refer to as global warming. Okay. So as you know, greenhouse gases. What are the greenhouse gases? It's like carbon dioxide, methane, etc. Right? So they are trap more heat in the atmosphere and thereby directly contribute to the heating of the atmosphere, right? So in general, we refer to this phenomena as, it's called global warming, right? So see, global warming does take place naturally as well, but anthropogenic activities, so that is human activities, so it has accelerated global warming. So, and deforestation also, deforestation and industrial development and also industrial activities and emissions from vehicles and industries. So they have all contributed to increase concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So thereby trapping more heat and triggering global warming around the globe. So since the climate science was evolving and scientific evidence was being brought out by institutions like IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? So it was conclusively being proven that only human activities were directly responsible for which one? Global warming and climate change, right? So finally, under these UN Convention climate change countries, they started acting together, they started working together, and they would meet at the Conference of Parties in every year, right? So the idea was to work out a way through which the emissions could be brought down, through which emissions intensity could be brought down, so that we can tackle global warming and climate change in the long-term process, right? So now, so what is a Kyoto Protocol? So under this convention, under the UN United Framework, right? UN Framework Convention and Climate Change, that is called UNFCCC, right? So after a few years of negotiations in the year of 1997, a very important agreement was worked out, that is known as the Kyoto Protocol, right? So it was signed in the year of 1997. So when the conference of parties was held at Kyoto, right? Kyoto. So Kyoto means Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto means, so this is, which is a city name in Japan, right? So this happened to be the first major agreement, a binding agreement that was signed under the Climate Change Convention. And it was signed, how many years? 5 years. So 5 years after the Climate Change Convention was launched in 1997. So this was the first binding agreement that was signed under the Climate Change Convention, right? So this is referred to as the Kyoto Protocol, and this 192 parties, 192 countries, almost every country in the world, almost every UN member signed and ratified this convention. So, however, Canada, right? So Canada did withdraw later. So, but that is a later development. So Canada withdraw from Kyoto Protocol in December 2012. So, and few countries have not ratified it at all, like United States. For example, the US was part of the negotiations, but it never ratified the this Kyoto Protocol, right? So now you see, let's understand a little more about this important agreement that is related to climate change and global warming, right? So under this Kyoto Protocol, the greenhouse gases, right? Greenhouse gases which had to be targeted were identified. So that is something that is unique about the Kyoto Protocol, right? So it was a very specific agreement. So which had specific provisions on how to tackle the threat posed by climate change. So this protocol identified, right? So specific greenhouse gases that were directly responsible for global warming. So this was based on scientific evidence and based on climate science, right? So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, um, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons and sulfur, um, hexafluoride, and these dangerous gases, they were identified, their contribution to global warming was exactly quantified, and it was brought out through a index. So that is at the global warming potential, right? So right, the global warming potential, it's called GWP, right? GWP, global warming potential. So it's of a greenhouse gas indicates the ability of this gas to contribute to global warming. So these greenhouse gases have tremendous potential to cause which one? Global warming, right? So that is to determine the this global warming potential, carbon dioxide is taken as the reference. So the carbon dioxide is the reference, that is Why the global warming potential for carbon dioxide is 1, right? So using carbon dioxide as a reference, so the ability to cause or contribute to global warming from other gases is calculated and quantified. So based on that, it is said that methane. So methane, it contributes how many times? 21 times. You see here. Just wait. Right. So methane contributes how many times? 21 times. You see here? 21 times more than which one? Carbon dioxide. So to global warming. So similarly, this NO2 and HFCs and also PFCs, so they all contribute many times more than what carbon dioxide does to global warming. So 1 ton of methane, 1 ton of methane will be 21 times more deadlier. It will be more prone to capture heat as compared to 1 ton of this 1 ton of carbon dioxide, right? So now you see is nitrous oxide also. Nitrous oxide is 310. So 310 times more potent. So when it comes to capturing heat and retaining heat, and hydrofluorocarbons and also perfluorocarbons. So these are also thousands, you see here, thousands of times more potent, and most potent is SF6, right? SF6, it's called sulfur hexafluoride. So which is nearly 24,000, right? 24,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to capturing heat in the atmosphere. So, but thankfully, the most prominent greenhouse gas is which one? Carbon dioxide. So that is followed by methane and also the other greenhouse gases which have a very high global warming potential. Their concentration level is less. So as a result, they don't contribute much to global warming as much as carbon dioxide and methane, right? So it is mainly because of their volume and distribution in the atmosphere. But nevertheless, all these are major greenhouse gases which significantly contribute to global warming. So these greenhouse gases were specifically identified by the Kyoto Protocol. Their source of emissions was also identified, right? So what sources are contributing to these emissions? What sources? So based on this, a plan was worked out, a strategy was brought out, which would place binding targets on certain countries to bring down the emissions of these greenhouse uh, gases. So remember the greenhouse gases that were identified by protocol. Remember the global warming potential and the sources of their emission, right? So based on this Kyoto Protocol provided for operationalizing climate change convention, right? It placed the primary responsibility on industrialized countries and economies in transition. So which were mainly responsible for historical emissions. So the developed countries, industrialization nations, the Western countries, in particular, European countries, right? European countries. European countries. So the European countries, few industrialized nations and economies in transition. So these countries were identified. They were placed under a separate category, a separate annex, and they were given a separate set of responsibilities, right? So the primary principle of Kyoto Protocol is CBDR. What is this CBDR? This is the underlying principle of Kyoto Protocol. So CBDR stands for what? What is that? Common but differentiated responsibilities. So this principle was mainly pushed by developing nations, right? Developing nations led by India and India, even by China also, right? So this is where you need to understand that at climate change negotiations, um, there has always been a divide, there has always been a conflict between the developed countries and the developing and undeveloped countries also, right? Undeveloped countries. So developed countries have always been on one side. They have a different argument, developing nations, and they have been on the other side of the conflict along with underdeveloped countries. So IDJs are at least least developed countries and small island states. They have all been on one side opposing the policies and also initiatives of developed nations. So what is this divide all about? See, when it comes to climate change, greenhouse gases, it have been emitted into the atmosphere, right? So since the beginning of the industrial revolution, right? So that is when humans started burning fossil fuels in large quantities. So that is when agriculture started expanding, industrial activities expanded, and deforestation increased. We were destroying natural carbon sinks, right? So we were extracting fossil fuels. So that is crude oil and gas burning them to power our industries and vehicle transportation, etc., etc. Right? So from late 1700s, right? So 1700s, right? 1700s, you see here. And early this 1800s, this is the year 1800s, is when we started releasing greenhouse gases in the large quantities when industrial revolution happened in Europe, right? Europe, massive amount of greenhouse gases were released. And these countries are developed today. So because they could freely burn fossil fuels for 150, right? 150 to 200 years. Okay, 200 years. So you see, you look at countries like, let's say, India or even China. So for that matter, or Sri Lanka or small Pacific islands and small African nations. So they are not responsible for historical emissions, right? So these countries have been burning fossil fuels only in the last few decades. So today, India, China might be the top emitters. So, but our emissions have increased only in the last 40 to 50 years. So why should these countries bear the burden for historical emissions? So this was always the question raised by developing nations and underdeveloped nations. So why should we should be responsible for historical emissions? Why? Because of if we take up targets and if we try to bring down our emissions, that could compromise our economic growth, right? So for countries like India or even Bangladesh, or let's say small Asian or African countries, right? So they can't afford to invest immediately in cleaner technologies and also renewable energy. They still need to depend on which one? Fossil fuels for some years, because they have a bigger socio-economic concern, right? So these countries are poor countries. They are dealing with poverty. They still have major social economic challenges, and the best way to overcome these challenges is through economic growth. And to power economic growth, you need fossil fuels, you at least for some time. So that is why the developing nations and underdeveloped nations, small island states, right? So they all came under the leadership of India and China. And during climate change negotiations, especially when Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. So they pushed historical emissions on developed and industrialized nations, right? So climate change is a common goal. No doubt every country has a common objective, right? So, but the responsibilities has to be differentiated. So we can't take the same responsibility as this US or UK, as France, Italy, those countries are developed, right? So they have achieved their socio-economic goals, so they should be responsible for historical emissions. They are the ones who released that greenhouse gases in the last 150 years, right? So based on this principle was included into Kyoto Protocol. It's known as CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. So that is common but differentiated responsibility. Remember this word, right? So this is the very foundation of Kyoto Protocol. It provides for equitable division of responsibilities based on the uh, capacities of those countries and based on the historical responsibilities of those countries. So accordingly, industrialized nations, developed nations, and few economic in transition, few European Central Asian countries, so which had burned fossil fuels for for at least few decades or at least 100 years. So those were identified and they were made responsible for historical emissions and historical responsibilities, right? So that's why the CBD are common but differentiated responsibilities, right? So the convention placed these responsibilities on new countries, and they had to follow these binding targets, right? Binding um, targets. And they had to report periodically and submit themselves to periodic reviews and monitoring through the climate change convention. So that is what is important about this Kyoto Protocol, right? So it divided these countries through annex-based structure, and countries have been placed under different annexes based on their historical emissions and based on their historical responsibilities, right? This one, okay? So in developed nations, industrialized nations like you see here, US, right? European countries and Russia and Japan, they are responsible for which one? Historical emissions since 1800s, right? This is the year 1850, right? 1800s, right? So that is since the days of the Industrial Revolution. So in the last 150 odd years, these were the countries which reaped the benefits of burning of fossil fuels. So this is how they triggered their economic growth. So this is how they solved their socio-economic problems. But they ended up releasing greenhouse gases and causing global warming and climate change. So they are responsible for these historical emissions and they should take up more responsibilities. So now compare this with the emissions of countries like India. You see here, India, right? So India or even this Brazil, right? So developing nations and smaller underdeveloped countries, their contribution to historical emissions is negligible. You see here, this is the graph, right? So India and other countries like Brazil, we have been burning fossil fuels maybe in the last, how many years? 40 and 50 years, right? So we should not be responsible for historical emissions. So this is the argument that has been ingrained into Kyoto Protocol through through the CBDR principle. So that is at the very heart of total protocol. Okay. So now Kyoto Protocol provisions. So under the Kyoto Protocol, countries were placed into different annexes, right? Different annexes. And you see here, Annex B, right? Annex B. Annex B countries, countries listed under Annex B, right? So they were given a set of binding emissions targets, right? Binding emission uh, targets. So they had to reduce their emissions through clean technologies and which one? Renewable energy. So around this 39, right? 39. 39 industrialized countries, developed nations, economies in transition, they were identified and they were given a set of, right, set of binding emission reduction targets. So that is, they have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions as prescribed by this Kyoto Protocol, right? So the target of Kyoto Protocol was to reduce emissions by 5%, right? 5% as compared to 1990 levels over a 5 years period between 2008 to 2012, right? So and this was the first um, period when Kyoto Protocol actually implemented and enforced, right? So, you see, even though this was signed in um, 1997, right? So it was not implemented until this 2008, right? So why? Why? Because of the conflict between developing and developed nations. So for one decade, the conflict carried on it when went on. The provisions of the protocol, they were not strictly enforced or implemented for almost one decade. So the US in particular was blocking its implementation, and also it eventually did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So finally, after several rounds of negotiations in this 2008, the first round of implementation was provided for and Kyoto Protocol was implemented for which 5 years, right? 5 years in the first commitment period, this first commitment period. So you see a 5 years period means 2008 to 2012. So this is 5 years period, right? So during this period, more 30 industrialized developed nations, they were placed under this Annex B, right? So it's basically a list of countries. So these countries were given binding emission targets and they have to achieve and meet these targets, right? You see here, this graphic, you can see the Annex B, right? Annex B here, okay? So Annex B countries, these are the Annex B countries. They include like Australia, many European nation countries like United States. So essentially, these are the industrialized nations and developed nations and a few economies in transition. So there is also something known as an Annex 1, right? Annex 1 countries. So which are under Annex 1 list. So these countries, they accepted to take the responsibility. It's more or less the same list under Annex 1. Okay, Annex 1. So there are a list of countries again developed and in the developed and industrialized nations which accepted to take binding targets, and the specific targets are mentioned in this under Annex B. So they have to invest in cleaner technologies and shift their economy from carbon-based economy to cleaner economy. So the other nations developing under developed nations which have no binding targets, they are called as non-annex countries, right? Non-annex countries. So like India, China, Colombia, Israel, South Africa, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, and also 140 countries is there, right? So we can think of this. So most of these countries were placed under non-annex, non-annex list. They did not have any binding targets, no targets on them, right? So whereas for Annex B, so Annex B countries, countries which had accepted to take up the responsibility under Annex 1, okay? So they were placed under Annex B and they are given a set of binding emission reductions targets, right? This one. So this why the Kyoto Protocol is so important. So it clearly specified the target and the responsibilities, and also put in a place review a mechanism and monitoring mechanism, right? So now this protocol was later amended in 2012 through the Doha, right? Doha, this Doha amendment during the Doha Conference of Parties. So that was held in the year of 2012. A few changes were introduced in this meeting. Okay. So into Kyoto Protocol to extend its implementation for a second period between 2013 and 2020. Okay. So its implementation was extended by 7 more years after 2012. So because otherwise Kyoto Protocol would have expired, right? Which means date is expired, right? So it's in we did not have any other climate change agreement, right? So at the Doha conference of parties, Kyoto Protocol was extended for the second period. That is, it was supposed to be implemented for 7 more years. So before they are giving 5 years only. Now it implemented for 7 more years from 2013 to 2020, right? So in previous year, 2008 8 to 2012. So this is the 5 years period. Now 2013 to 2020, this is the 7 years period implemented. Okay. So through these amendments, a few new commitments were placed on the Annex 1 countries. So the countries which had agreed to take additional responsibilities, they were given few new targets and new commitments. So few new greenhouse gases were also to the list which had to be reported by the countries that were implementing these targets, right? So, but this time through this Doha Amendment, the overall targets of Kyoto Protocol was raised. So, in the first commitment period, the goal was to, what is that? What is the goal? Reduce emissions by 5%, right? 5% as compared to 1990 levels, right? So, but the second commitment period target was raised to how much? So, this is 5%. Now, 18%, right? 18% reduction in emissions as compared to 1990 levels, right? 1990 levels. So before also say 1990 levels, but that is the 5% only, but it is raised up to 18% reduction, right? So the overall target was raised from 5% reduction to how much? 18% reduction, right? So that's why this Doha amendment is very, very significant, okay? So now the Kyoto mechanisms. What are the Kyoto mechanisms? And Kyoto Protocol provided for several mechanisms to achieve these targets and to implement these targets. So under this protocol, the countries like Annex B countries, so they primarily to meet their targets, right? Meet their targets through their national measure, through their national measures. So that is, they have to bring out few national laws and policies, right? So that they can adapt uh, cleaner technologies, right? Cleaner technologies. So they can move away from carbon and adapt cleaner forms of fuel, adapt solar, wind, nuclear power. So if required. So, but the idea was to push them away from which one? Carbon-based industries and carbon-based agriculture, right? So the idea was to tackle deforestation and promote afforestation because forests are a natural carbon sinks, right? Natural carbon sinks. So any such measure could be taken up by these countries which were listed under Annex B, right? This Annex B. This. So it's up to them. They have to decide how they will achieve the targets. So every country based on their historical emissions, right? So they will be given an emission reduction target. They have to bring down their emissions year on year as per the given target. And through their national laws and policies, they have to decide how they will reduce their emissions, right? So for example, they cannot shut down coal-based power plants and switch to solar power. So they can make their industrial process more efficient. They can make their vehicle transportation more efficient to reduce emissions, right? So they can switch to electric vehicle from fossil-based fuels. So through such national strategies, countries are supposed to achieve their targets, right? So apart from that, this Kyoto Protocol also provided for innovative mechanisms for carbon, sorry, carbon trading, and it created a carbon market as well, right? So, and it provided for very unique market-based mechanism, right? Very unique based market-based mechanism through which Annex B countries can achieve their targets. So mechanisms like international emission trading. So it was introduced through this a country, let's say the Canada, right? Canada, for example, let's say Canada has been given a target of 50, right? 50 gigatons, 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide. How much? 50 gigatons, right? So I'm just talking a hypothetical example here, right? So let's say the Canada cannot emit more than this 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide in a given year. That is the target given to Canada, right? So let's say US also has been given the same target. So, but United States might fail to implement the reduction measures and eventually based on its final reporting, uh, its overall emissions, right? Its overall emissions for that year. So it might be 53 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Okay. So US has breached its target, exceeded the emissions targeted by 3 gigatons, right? 3 gigatons. So on the other hand, the Canada might have invested in cleaner technologies. It might have invested in solar power, in cleaner fuels, cleaner technologies, and it might have brought down its emissions, and its overall emissions for that year might just be how much? 47, right? 47 gigatons. So now what Canada can do is it can monostate the remaining units. So right now Canada has earned 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide, right? So this can be converted into trading units, and then carbon trading units. It's known as CER, right? CER. Okay. It stands for carbon emission reduction, right? And certified emission reduction. So it's a certified emission reduction. It is a certificate, right? It's a certificates. So that certifies that this country has saved these number of emissions. So these units of emissions, those certified units can be traded in the carbon market. And it is similar to how you trade your financial instruments and financial derivative instruments, right? So just like you trade in gold or bonds, right? Or in commodities. So similarly, a country which had achieved the target and it had earned certified emission reduction or carbon credit. So this carbon credit could be sold, traded to other countries which had breached their targets. So now US in this example, we have taken US which has breached the target. Breached the target can purchase the carbon credit units from this Canada, right? So Canada will earn money through that revenue, through that, and Canada will be incentivized to shift to cleaner technologies. So some of the countries like US which are breaching the target can pay for the contribution. So they are making to climate change, and that will be a disincentive for them. So that they will be pushed to invest in cleaner technologies. So the idea was to push countries to reduce emissions around the world or globe, right? So because emissions, if it is reduces in Canada or US, does not really matter, right? So at the end of the day, so that there is one side of the argument, right? So one side of the argument, they support this market-based mechanism, this market-based mechanism. Because if countries are reaching their targets, they can pay for it, right? So that creates a disincentive and pushes them to invest in cleaner technology. So overall, at the global level, there will be a reduction of emissions. So such market-based mechanisms were created, but there has been a lot of criticism against this as well, because it allows ways for developed nations to breach their targets, and countries, they may not care about the targets, they simply might breach them, pay money for that, and purchase carbon credits from other countries, right? So which are actually achieved emission reduction, right? So that will not really help the global of climate change. And this is the criticism against the market-based carbon trading mechanism. So it also provided for clean development mechanism, that is CDM, right? So through which Annex B list countries, that is countries which are developed, industrialized, which have been given binding targets, right? So, and also they can fund clean projects and in developing nations in non-annexed countries, non-annex, right? So even for this, they will earn carbon credits. So for example, let's say France can fund a solar project, right? So in India. So India is a non-annex list, right? Non-annex country. So, and France will earn carbon credits and it can sell that in the carbon trading market, right? So the next another mechanism called joint implementation, JI. Giant implementation, it was created through which Annex B countries can collaborated. So that is to developed nations can work together and help each other. So each other to achieve their targets, right? So let's say, for example, UK. UK can collaborate with Canada, right? So UK can fund a clean project in Canada, and UK will earn carbon credits which can be used to meet its national targets. So such a target-based market-based mechanism. So these it was created through the Kyoto Protocol, right? So many trading mechanisms were created like emissions trading, clean development mechanism, and also this giant implementation. Okay. Now monitoring emission targets. So, and that is to ensure that the countries are meeting the targets um, uh, through a review, right? Through review and monitoring mechanism was put in place. So this is the best part about Kyoto Protocol. So a review and monitoring mechanism was put in place to ensure that in which one? Annex B countries. So those are meeting their targets, right? These are meeting their targets. So they have to report on their progress. They are to provide periodic reports to climate change convention, that is to show that they are complying with the given targets. So if they are breaching the targets, they have to purchase carbon credits from other countries. So which have actually achieved a reduction in emissions. So such a monitoring mechanism was put in place, and even an adoption fund was provided for to provide funding for developing nations and underdeveloped nations, right? So adaptation fund was set up through which climate finance could be generated, through which developed nations and Annex B countries will pull their money, their resources together, and financial assistance would be provided through this adaptation fund, right? So that the most threatened countries can take adaptation measures, low-lying countries, especially like Maldives, right? Maldives and also Pacific island states, countries like Bangladesh also, right? So these countries are very vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels, right? Sea levels. So they would receive assistance to the adaptation fund, and they can take adaptation measures to protect themselves against the threats posed by climate change. So these were the important features and provisions of Kyoto Protocol, and it was implemented in two different periods, right? So as of now, the Kyoto Protocol is no longer in place because it was replaced in 2015 through the Paris Agreement, right? So the Paris Agreement became the second binding agreement under Climate Change Convention, right? So currently, this Paris Agreement is the primary climate change treaty, right? So it is essentially replaced the Kyoto Protocol. But nevertheless, many countries followed their commitments until which one? 2020. And that's why Kyoto Protocol is very, very important. You see, the Kyoto Protocol also established a uh, rigorous monitoring, review, and verification system, as well as a complaint system to ensure transparency and hold parties to account. So under this protocol, countries' actual emissions have to be monitored, and precise records have to be kept of the trades carried out. And adaptation. Adaptation means the Kyoto Protocol, like the UNFCCC, that is also designed to assist, right? Assist countries in adapting to the adverse effects of climate change. So it facilitates the development of technologies that can help increase resilience to the impact of climate change. So the adaptation fund was established to finance adaptation projects and programs in developing countries that are parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So many countries followed their commitments until 2020. So that's why this Kyoto Protocol is very, very important, right? So this is the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. So any doubts in this lesson? Only 4 members there. Pavani, Raki Kumari, real meaning. Who is this? So any doubts?
No, ma'am.
Okay, right. So now I will stop my lesson. Okay. Next class is I think 11:45 maybe, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So right, all of you, bye.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So this is the uh, Kyoto Protocol, right? So these are the important in your examinations. So what is the difference between Montreal and Kyoto? So while the Montreal Protocol was established to phase out substances, so that depleting ozone layer, right? Now the Kyoto Protocol was set in a place to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. So with the exception to ozone depleting substances, right? So Kyoto Protocol was established to phase out substances that deplete ozone, right? Uh, Montreal and Kyoto Protocol was in place to reduce the emissions. So this is the difference between Montreal Protocol and Kyoto Protocol, right? Okay, right.